Kia ora koutou. Let's resume day 2 of this particular hearing. Just a couple of matters to comment on before we resume with Blue Haven. I learned this morning that those of you who've got teeth as long as mine, that Arnold Turner passed away this week. So after a stellar career, so I just want to acknowledge Arnold. Secondly, we have a legal statement tabled from Bay of Plenty Regional Council. I just want to read that into the record. Following the withdrawal by Tauranga City Council of the coastal matters, they've obviously decided not to pursue their particular issues. So just put that on the record. Is there anything else that anybody wants to raise before we? No. Okay. Yes.
Would I be able to comment on the Regional Council legal submission? Just to be clear, as far as Council are concerned and are aware that Regional Council are still pursuing those landscape matters, we've been working with Regional Council with our technical experts and their technical experts and undertaking that assessment and then appropriate planning provisions.
All right, so that's over and above the inner harbour coastal erosion and instability issues and so on.
Correct. That's in relation to natural hazards. Yeah, the erosion. Yeah. Correct.
Okay, thank you. All right. Welcome. You seem like a long way away. Yes. You might want to put your microphone on.
Good morning. Craig Batchelor. I'm here on behalf of Blue Haven Investments Limited, which is part of the Blue Haven Group. Just want to start by putting in apologies for Nathan York, the CEO, who had intended to be here this morning but can't make it now. So, but I have had a talk with him this morning, particularly around the rebuttal statement that came through. So he's aware of all that. So I was just going to highlight a few points and then take any questions if you have any. I've set up my experience and just noted a conflict of interest potentially there around smart growth. The Blue Haven Group, for those who aren't familiar, Blue Haven control fairly large area at Papamoa East, Wairake, known as Golden Sands. It's about 180 hectares altogether. They've developed a lot of that and sold a lot of it, but their primary development interest now relates to the what's called the Sands Town Centre. The Plan Change 33 has reasonably significant implications across their land holding, zoning all of the residential land to either medium or high density, additional height around the Sands Town Centre and Excelsior Commercial Centre, and residential provisions in the town centre and 4 enabled commercial centres are also proposed to change. So they've got a number of areas they have an interest in. Having said that, Blue Haven do support generally the MDRS. It really aligns with their direction of what they're trying to achieve with intensification and development based around centres and walkability. It's been their approach throughout, so that the fundamentals are supported. One issue that Blue Haven has raised, this is a paragraph or section 9 of my evidence, is around the proposed deletion of diagram 15, the commercial centres network. And Blue Haven see this as an important policy instrument that gives spatial expression to the written objectives and policies. That really does help understand how the centres relate to each other spatially. The Tauranga Commercial Centre strategy was last reviewed in 2007 comprehensively. That was a sub-regional review across the Western Bay sub-region. There was a review initiated in 2017, which Bluehaven took a very active role in, but that wasn't completed. Not sure where or how that landed in the end. The concern is that a significant decision to remove diagram 15 without having done a comprehensive review sub-regionally is seen as undesirable. Through our pre-hearing discussions with council, we understood there was support for retaining that diagram, but with the commercial centres naming amended to align with the national planning standards. So I'm not sure what happened with that. That's not covered in the reports to date, but that might be a matter of detail for later. But the Bluehaven are definitely still interested in that issue. There's commentary in here around the commercial centres expert conference caucusing, which unfortunately I didn't attend. And the statement here raises some questions around the scope of the assessment work that's been undertaken at the present time. And just noting in the rebuttal evidence from council, that does clarify the scope of that work, which answers that question. The final point made here is around the definition of centres at Golden Sands, particularly the town centre, and what might happen with that through the current review work. And it's not entirely clear where that might land. Bluehaven's town centre has a number of descriptions in the district plan, both town centre, sub-regional centre and regional centre. Sands town centre is long-term going to serve a large catchment in the east, and it's been designed and planned with that in mind. There is actually an economic assessment that was done as part of the consenting for the town centre, which identifies the scale of the catchment and its function. And I think it would be useful to share that information with Mr. Heath, who's doing that work, so we can supply that to inform that analysis, if that's of some use. The final point is in relation to the Excelsior local centre. The concern there that would be categorised amongst a large number of other very small centres, whereas that centre is quite diverse and still has scope for expansion. And Bluehaven are wanting to ensure that the economist undertaking the work understands the diversity of that centre and what its future prospects are. And hence the question around what engagement would take place as part of that research work. Sometimes what you see on the ground isn't necessarily what is the future. So an overall, Bluehaven's real strong interest is in ensuring that their centres are properly recognised and provided for in the district plan, based on not just how they are today, but what their future prospects are. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for that. And I'm assuming that that you're signalling an active interest in future expert conferencing once that economic report is available.
That's right. I'll be attending along with an economist for Bluehaven.
Not always a good idea to bring an economist along, Craig. Yes, right. Council, do you want to respond to anything?
So just in terms of, I suppose some of these matters are probably better covered in session 2. I think in terms of, the diagram, we have discussed that with Bluehaven in a discussion in preparation for the hearing to respond to those submissions. And in terms of the commercial work underway, have shared with them the outcomes that first round of expert conferencing through a meeting, and encourage them to come along to this next stage, and would also welcome any further technical work that we can provide to our expert that may help to inform that work. Just noting that these reports are due to be public on Monday, there may not be time to take that work into consideration for expert conferencing, but definitely we can consider it through the hearing.
Yeah, and obviously we would encourage as much closure on those matters as possible prior to the hearing, even if it's, and we need to get a second round of expert conferencing going on that. Questions for Craig?
Just one of clarification from me. You say in your statement that you didn't attend the commercial centres conferencing. I just wasn't clear whether in your statement you were saying you, or whether you were expressing a view as to the outcomes from that conferencing. Have you got any views on, do you agree or disagree with what, whether issues got to in the expert conferencing for commercial centres, or is that what your evidence covers in terms of the issues around the categorisation of the centres?
I agree with the outcomes in terms of looking at the future prospects for centres as part of the assessment. Reading the notes from the conferencing, it wasn't entirely clear where that was going to land as far as the methodology of doing that work, and that was what I was interested in. Just wanted to make the point, and I think that's come through. I'm assuming that the bullet points in the rebuttal were basically the scope of the brief to Mr. Heath.
I think, Ms. Batchelor, we'll see you again in a few months' time.
Thanks very much.
Mr. Matheson and cohort. Yes. Good to see a change of livery for Tauranga. Is the message the same?
Good morning. Thank you, and thank you for accommodating my attendance today. I think I was originally scheduled for yesterday, but I was moving house, and that means actually moving the house, not furniture into the house, actually houses. So it was reasonably stressful.
Are you moving out of Auckland?
I'm trying. I'm getting there. So I've got Miss Lizelle Benneker from Kaingaroa with me, Principal Development Planner. She doesn't have a statement of evidence, but will be able to answer any questions, and will be presenting evidence for hearing 2. And Ms. Susanna Tate, obviously, who will be presenting evidence today. At the outset, I would just like to put on the record on behalf of Kaingaroa that they really appreciate the engagement they've had with Council through this process. Certainly I can appreciate it's piece of legislation that's emerged from the bowels of Wellington as a bit of a submissional sidewind that everyone's had to deal with. Lawyers have had to deal with it, planners have had to deal with it.
I think it's more of a submissional headwind, isn't it, rather than sidewind? Yes.
Possibly intended to be a tailwind, but so yeah, we're all trying to deal with this. Some of the provisions in the legislation, I think, with good intent, probably aren't worded the clearest. And I guess as an overall comment, one thing I would say, and it's a bit of a theme of my submissions and comments today, is that, one needs to, I think, step back and say, what is the Enabling Housing Supply Legislation Amendment Act intended to do? And in accordance with the Supreme Court's direction, of course, you interpret and apply legislation in accordance with its purpose and on its terms. And I think if you're in doubt about why any particular provisions should be interpreted or applied, I think it's often helpful to go back and say, well, what are we trying to do here? Well, we're trying to enable housing. That's fundamentally what the Act says. And I think interpretations that support that outcome should be preferred over ones that, because of an academic or a nuanced subtlety in wording do not, then they should not be preferred. And then I guess the second introductory comment I wanted to make on that, and I am grateful for the council uploading yesterday on YouTube. I was able to catch that late last night, some late night viewing of Mr. Fisher's presentations and questions, which were helpful to understand some of the questions from the panel and the council's position. So that was helpful for me. I think it's fair to say there's a bit of planning subtlety in some of this stuff, and I guess what I would like to say is for the 823 applicants in Tauranga who are waiting for a house, it's more than academic interest. Every night they don't have a house is a night they sleep on the couch or in the garage or somewhere else. And the other point I'd like to make is that out of those applicants, 393 are one bedroom and 239 are two bedroom. So the focus is on smaller units. And, again, when it comes to things like intensity and density, it's enabling affordable smaller units that is really important in achieving that broader outcome of the legislation and the housing supply. There's no point providing housing that no one can afford. There's no point providing 5-bedroom houses if people want 1-bedroom houses. I obviously prepared and circulated legal submissions. With your leave, Ms. Chair, I don't intend to read through that, but if you're happy, there are some introductory comments I'd just like to draw attention to, and then probably focus on the jurisdiction points, if that's okay. Thank you. So section 1 is really the introduction, which you'll be familiar with. At 1.6, I do just want to make the point here, and it reiterates, I guess, the earlier point I made, which is that the Kaingaroa submissions are not intended to increase the burden on councils, but rather challenge traditional thinking about growth, urban communities, housing provision, and infrastructure integration. And Kaingaroa's, the benefit that they bring, I guess, to the councils is an ability to have a national perspective and a national responsibility and ambit that's broader than anything we've seen before. And, for better or worse, it has, the legislation, has empowered the organisation to actually make some change. And, we can't fix a problem by doing the same things we've always done. So things have to be different. And yes, that will be uncomfortable for some people. Yes, that will change the amenity in some environments. But unless we change, we will still have the same problem. So in section 2, and I'm happy to take much of this as read, this is really about Kaingaroa and its statutory mandate. I guess the point for those, any commissioners or others who are not familiar, is that it's not just about developing its own land holdings. And I guess that's the most important point, is a strong part of Kaingaroa's mandate is to provide planning provisions that enable urban development of all land, not just its own land. And it is, it may seem strange turning up to hearings up and down the country, applying, asking for more enabling provisions on everybody else's land. But that's one of its statutory purposes, is to enable good urban form outcomes on all land, on the basis that if all land is enabled, then housing will happen, and whether it's on Kaingaroa's land or other land. And that really deals with 2.3, 2.4. Turning now, Yeah, turning now to the ISP statutory assessment matters. And I guess the first thing I'd say on this is that an IPI is specifically defined in Section 80E. And I think, in listening to Mr. Fisher's presentation yesterday, I think it's really important to draw a distinction between what an IPI is and what you need to consider when assessing an IPI. And I think they're two very different things. And an IPI has deliberately been framed reasonably narrowly, but not as narrowly, I think, as the council submissions would suggest. But in assessing an IPI, it is necessary to undertake a broader assessment. So I think that's quite an important distinction just to bear in mind. So when you're looking at some of the questions that are raised, I think it is important to have that context. What is an IPI? Because that has a specific process it has to go through. But what do you need to take into account when assessing an IPI? And that's broader. I think, and then at 3.2, 3.3 of the legal submissions, and then in 3.4, obviously set out the statutory framework. And that does require the broader assessment of the normal types of things that one would assess when considering a plan change, with the qualification, of course, that all those matters apply to the extent they relate to an IPI as defined by Section 80E. And that makes sense because ultimately these provisions need to sit in a plan and they need to work with the rest of the plan. And so they need to, as comfortably as possible, fit within the plan, and they need to be assessed with regard to the broader RMA provisions as they relate to an IPI. I don't agree with the suggestion that an IPI, that policies 3 and 4 are the only relevant consideration. They are the mandatory considerations, and that's made very clear by Section 80E. Now, if I was suspicious, I'd say that legislation was worded as mandatory, so the council did what it was told by the legislation. You must do these things. But in the next two provisions, they also give broad discretion as to a range of other things that can be included to support and enable the housing supply. Those other matters are much broader than just policies 3 and 4. And it makes sense to draw specific attention to policies 3 and 4 because they are very directive policies that basically tell you what to do. And so it does make sense to draw attention to those. But if you're looking at the broader, matters in Section 1B, for example, there's clear discretion on a panel to provide or amend other provisions that support or are consequential on the enabling of housing. And that's enabling housing, not disenabling housing. In terms of the statutory discretion, this panel, very experienced members, you'll be well aware that you must exercise discretion reasonably, not capriciously or arbitrarily. In my submission, it would be completely inappropriate to simply say, I'm not going to consider any other provisions. That's not an exercise of discretion. That's ignoring a requirement to assess it. So while you do have scope as to what additional matters you do include, you can't just say, I'm not going to include anything else because I don't want to. You need to turn your mind to it and say, do we include these or not? Do they support the outcomes or not? And then are there any other considerations why you shouldn't? In my submission, the scope of that is significantly strengthened, or that interpretation rather is significantly strengthened by clause 99 of the schedule, which of course gives the panel jurisdiction to make any changes, even if they weren't raised in submissions, which is quite an extraordinary proposition if one thinks about it. Wyke and I said, yes, it still needs to be an IPI, fine, like we understand that, because this is all about IPIs. So you can't use that process to say, we're gonna do something which is clearly not an IPI relating to housing supply. Authorise a, I don't know, stadium or something. I mean, that, a rugby stadium or a football stadium, that would clearly, that would not be an IPI. But the statutory legislation has expressly given the panel that power, in my submission, to deal with, enable hearing panels like this to say, well, what's the best outcome? Even if it hasn't been specifically asked, what's the best outcome that would give effect to these provisions, as long as it's an IPI. One of the other jurisdiction points that were raised was the enabling additional papakainga. And again, in section 80E, there's this expressibility for an IPI to provide for papakainga. So I didn't understand in the council's the schedule to the 42A report, which is effectively the legal submissions, how they, and well, put it this way, when Kainga-Ora's submission was, we want to enable additional opportunities for papakainga, why the council seems to be of the view that's not squarely within section 80E on its face. Leaving aside the broader powers and discretion, why doesn't it fit within that? Because that seems to be exactly what Kainga-Ora is doing. In fact, the two provisions, one is to enable additional opportunities for papakainga, phrased very broadly, and the second one was to increase density, which is enabling housing supply by enabling more people to live in a certain area. Now, if that doesn't support or enable an outcome of enabling housing supply, I don't know what does. Yeah, and then I think there was some discussion too about objective, the broader provisions in the MPSUD, and including, of course, objective 1, well-functioning urban environments, which is a bit of motherhood and apple pie. One would hope that plans didn't aim to provide not well-functioning urban environments. Be that as it may, there seems to be a view that you can't have regard to objectives when assessing an IPI. That would be quite an extraordinary proposition in my submission. And in fact, given that the MDRS Schedule 3 requires that objective essentially in exactly the same wording to be put into plans, there's a clear explanation why policies 3 and 4 are referred to and not objective 1. It's because if you go to a Schedule 3A, objective 1 is sitting there in black and white. And it says you must include this. So it doesn't need to be referred to in section 80E because it's referred to in the attachment. So in my submission, the broader objectives of the MPSUD are directly relevant to an assessment of an IPI. And in the context, obviously, of objective 1, that finds its way into the plans through Schedule 3A. I think I've, in a reasonably roundabout way, the other point I do want to make, and I might be, so the other 2 points that was considered to be out of scope were the not on the plan change, because Kainga-Ora tried in their submission to make some nice comments about the council's processes and said we'd like to work with the council further on these matters. I don't mean to be a pedant about it, but it just seems a bit harsh to say there's no jurisdiction. And I guess our request is that, or my request anyway, is that be noted as not a submission, because it clearly wasn't a submission. No relief was sought. It was simply a comment. And I guess we wouldn't want to be seen as that's no jurisdiction for that. It just should not have been given a submission point number.
I take it you don't want us to note that in a recommendation.
No, well, I guess it's just more a point that that it's not a jurisdiction issue. It just shouldn't have been a submission. Not that I'm taking it personally. And I think that's pretty much anything else. Otherwise, happy to answer any questions. or I'll ask Ms. Tate, and then perhaps we can answer questions together. So whichever works.
Thank you, Mr. Mason. Just one from me. I just want, and I guess when you're talking about our 99 power and the operative plan, I take it from what you're saying that you're comfortable that should we find something in the plan that actually might pull in the contrary direction to the task that we have in hand, that we would be empowered to actually amend that. And if so, how far could we go in that?
Yeah, well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because, of course, I think you have to, otherwise you have an incoherent plan, and it will simply cause debates down the line, because someone will apply for consent and they'll go, well, this, and then they'll go, well, but that says you can't do that, and that says you have to do that, which just seems to be a very unsatisfactory planning outcome. So in my submission, you are empowered to make the change to the extent you remove the inconsistency. And of course, the legislation considered the prospect of an RPS being inconsistent and specifically said, well, it doesn't matter, you've still got to do what you've got to do. And the reason they didn't make the same comment, I think, in respect of plans themselves is because they anticipated that a hearing panel would ensure that its provisions that it inserted worked in the plan, including, if necessary, through the Clause 99 power.
Just one from me in relation to the initial submission you made about interpreting and applying the legislation in accordance with its purpose and terms. Of course, the Enabling Act doesn't have a separate purpose clause. So in terms of when we are looking at what the purpose is, are we looking at the purpose of the RMA, or are we looking at other clauses of the legislation to guide our interpretation of it?
Thank you, Commissioner. So the Environment Court in Waikanae, paragraph 31, had the same issue. At that paragraph, they said, rather tongue-in-cheek, potentially, for reasons we've endeavoured to articulate, we find that the purpose of the IPI process inserted into the RMA by the EHAA was to impose on residential zone land more permissive standards for permitted activities to address those matters. So, if nothing else, that's an interpretation of the purpose. But I guess fundamentally, I'd look at the words of the Housing Supply Enabling Act, go, well, that must be its purpose. But I appreciate it doesn't have a purpose clause.
And the other one is probably more for the substantive, but just since it's top of mind is, do you know how many houses or sections that Kāinga Ora currently has in Tauranga?
We'll find out. We'll let you know when Ms. Tate's finished.
Yeah, no,
I'll phone a friend.
Yeah, thank you.
Do you have any?
Not many, if any, no. Getting less by the day.
Yes. Right, Ms. Tate, welcome again.
Good morning. Am I
Yeah.
on? I have got a relatively short statement here, and I'll just shoot through and paraphrase or highlight some of the key points. I've appeared in front of a couple of you before, but I'm Susanna Tate. I'm a partner at Plans Consultants, and I'm here providing planning expertise for Kāinga Ora. At section 6 of my evidence, I just want to generally support Plan Change 33 and the process adopted. I consider that the Council has been enabling and not unduly restricted in its approach to implementing the NPS and the Housing Supply Act. Just jumping to section 7 of my evidence, the first point there is about the change that Kāinga Ora sought to the definition of papakainga. The reason for this change is to enable papakainga on general title land and not just restrict it to land held under the Māori Land Act. And I consider this is appropriate to enable papakainga to develop on general title land and not restrict it to Māori freehold or customary land. I think this enables Māori to live in a manner congruent with their social and cultural needs throughout the city.
Can I just ask a question in relation to that before you move on? So under Te Turu Whenua Māori, there are obviously 3 categories of land, Māori freehold, Māori customary, and then general land held by Māori. And that can be general title land, but it has to have a 50% ownership by Māori. So is it necessary, I guess, is this change, given that the existing wording would apply to general land held by 50% or more Māori owners, or are you seeking that extension beyond that point so that it could apply to any land whether or not it was majority owned by Māori?
I guess the change in the definition here would seek the most enabling scenario compared to the restriction that you talk about. So just moving on to the discussion in my evidence about the density limits in shared accommodation. So Kāinga Ora sought that this move from 8 to 10. And I guess my comments on that is shared accommodation is essential housing within the community, and being able to provide for more people in these settings assists with housing opportunities and arguably equates to no material difference in effects. Moving on to paragraph 8.4. So we're just discussing the commercial zone hierarchy or the recategorisation of the commercial centres within Tauranga. And I'm sure you're aware of the exercise that the council put out Appendix 15. There was subsequent work undertaken by Property Economics and presented at conferencing. There was a change to some of the categories that applied to the existing commercial centres. I understand there's more ongoing work, so these comments are very much preliminary, acknowledging what's still to come. But the consequences of recategorising centres is that the plan-enabled density within and adjacent to Pies Park, Golden Sands and Welcome Bay will be removed. And the plan-enabled density within and adjacent to Cameron Road and Mount Maunganui will be reduced. There will be some gains if Beretta is upzoned, but change resulting from the recommendations for Gate Pa and Tauranga Crossing will not be realised as the council has fixed the town centre and status quo for those centres respectively. I guess my points that support where the council got through in their Appendix 15 assessment, I consider Appendix 15, the methodology, to be appropriate and comprehensive, and there seems to be little merit in moving away from that. The NPS is enabling, and a potential oversupply of capacity is not inappropriate, particularly within centres. And I consider the consequences of not providing an enabling framework may result in lost opportunities through underdevelopment and underinvestment. The recategorisation of the centres will affect the quantum or spatial extent of the high density zone, and I'll come to that again shortly. And then I guess the next 2 points, D and E, really just speak to this idea of there is an investment plan and there's long-term planning, and if we start to strip away the functions of these centres, then we will not realise the maximise the return on the investment through UFD, long-term planning. So it's really just about making the most efficient use of land and maximising the return. I just want to acknowledge Ms. Speedy's rebuttal evidence where she notes that there'll be a subsequent plan change, and that's fine. I think that was one of Kāinga Ora's submission points, to be involved in that process as it goes through.
The
not submission point, sorry. So the high density spatial extent, so if the centres are downgraded as a result of the property economics work, there'd be a consequential spatial recalculation of the high density zone around them. And given the housing shortages within the city are significant and growing, and that's a comment direct from Mr. Mead's evidence, I consider it appropriate to maintain the plan-enabled high-density zone. I acknowledge that there are feasibility and realisability constraints, but I guess a pretty strong part of my argument is that reserving the best land now is appropriate for the long-term growth of the city, acknowledging that typology demands financing, technology and engineering change over time, and so will feasibility. Mount Maunganui North, just a very brief comment there that, again, one of Kāinga Ora's non-submission points was that they would like to work with the council through the spatial planning process, but the fact that that work is being brought forward into this process is great. Again, it just means that the land has a better chance of being developed in accordance with any higher density enablement, rather than potentially missing those opportunities. And that's a brief summary, maybe.
Yes, just picking up at the Mount Maunganui North. Yesterday we heard from Sanderson and they're seeking a increased height in that area. Does Kāinga Ora have a position on that?
I think that the position on that is that would be informed by the technical reporting that looks at landscape and cultural values. And so, yes, obviously, the more is better, but that more has to fit within any constraints that exist in the Mount Maunganui area, of which the cultural constraints are well acknowledged and identified.
Thank you. Just looking at your discussion about the recategorisation of the centres, you're probably more up to speed with this than me. In terms of the further work being carried out by Property Economics, is that using the same methodology that the council have used to date?
Ms. Speedy is probably the best person to answer that question.
Yes, so the methodology remains the same, but it's the process of classifying or identifying the commercial component. So it's reflecting on submissions that we've received, which I mentioned yesterday on the Pies Pa, Otamotai and Mount area, that we need technical work from a commercial centre's perspective to respond to identifying the type of centre.
So having heard that from your perspective, you raised issues with the fact that, if centres are downgraded, that therefore leads to less intensification around them. But if you are saying that you support the methodology, isn't that it? If you support the methodology, you therefore recognise that centres may be downgraded and therefore the intensification around them may reduce? Or are you actually saying you don't agree with the level of intensification that's suggested around each type of centre?
I support the methodology set out in Appendix 15, which, if I may suggest, it's probably more of a planning argument rather than an economic argument. And I think that the big issue that plays into this is that Tauranga has a very high level of plan-enabled capacity, but they've recognised that the realisability of this is quite low. So in my mind, that further strengthens the argument of having more plan-enabled capacity, so we don't lose that realisable capacity as well.
Pick that one up because I was going to ask a very similar question. So is Kāinga Ora going to be contesting the translation exercise or your alternate relief, which seems to be to expand the high density zone?
I don't think there's an expansion of the high density zone being sought by Kāinga Ora, but certainly they wouldn't want to see any reduction. As far as I'm aware, and maybe Ms. Beneke can speak to this more than I can, Kāinga Ora are looking to engage an economic expert just to run their eyes over the work by Property Economics and I understand it's market economics who are undertaking further work looking at the capacity, the realisable and feasible capacity based on the shift that's occurred. So I guess I'm very conscious that there's a lot of balls in the air, so I don't want to back myself into a corner just at this point without the...
And the question wasn't designed to do that. I just want to anticipate what might be coming forward in October, that's all.
We wouldn't be looking for more. The submission was that Kāinga Ora support what was notified. And
so can I put it slightly differently then? So is the thrust of the argument that you accept the projection in terms of what's needed going forward, and you're trying to make sure that in actual fact there is sufficient excess capacity, if you like, to realise that? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Good morning. Just to help me a little bit, in terms of you just referred to realisable capacity and the planning, the IPI providing surplus capacity. Can you just quickly summarise for me what you see as the issues for realisable capacity?
Realisable capacity is, so plan enabled, you have this X amount zoned, but within that there may be qualifying matters or geotechnical matters. And I guess a really good example is that I can speak to, Ms. Bennick might be able to provide you some better examples, but Kāinga Ora hold land over in Rotorua. They were able to do X stories, but actually the soil conditions didn't provide for that. So the realisable, what they were able to realise on that land was reduced, what was plan enabled. And feasibility is obviously an economic argument around returns, financial gain from the development of the land and the selling on of it, which is less of a consideration for Kāinga Ora, but that's probably not for me to speak to.
They would be the main ones that you would see, would they?
Pardon, the main constraints to being realisable?
Yes.
Natural hazards, ground conditions, waterways, any setbacks from waterways, those sorts of things. Section 6 matters.
Thank you.
Infrastructure.
Don't the QMs already come off realisable capacity though? Sorry, not realisable, plan enabled, sorry. The QMs already come off plan enabled, so realisable is then a product of that. You've got the other ones which aren't covered by QMs, such as ground conditions and things may not be known and aren't a QM, so they will impact realisable. But
yeah,
plan enabled is already impacted by QMs.
Depends on activity status. So plan enabled is defined as permitted, controlled or restricted discretionary. So where a qualifying matter is a discretionary or non-complying activity, then it will be counted or removed from your plan enabled capacity. The work that we're doing through the feasible capacity and the realisable is exactly what Ms. Tate is highlighting, that while it might be a restricted discretionary activity and so plan enabled, the cost to mitigate that effect of a natural hazard or ground conditions may make it unfeasible to develop. Another kind of key realisable that we will be needing to take into account is what we discussed yesterday in terms of covenants, and that we are heavily affected. So while we can't have a definitive number, we have a really clear idea across the city of where we have limitations of the ability to do further subdivision in the second dwelling, which will be taken into account in that development capacity assessment.
So I didn't note it. What were the activity status of the ones that you said would be plan enabled, permitted and?
Permitted, controlled and restricted discretionary are identified as plan enabled, and so yeah, discretionary and non-complying activities as a qualifying matter are taken into account in the modelling for plan enabled.
And maybe if we just talk sideways for a moment, I mean, if market economics is doing the work, they've already done something very similar for the Waikato IPIs that we've already seen, and they explain in those texts, and I assume they will do the same thing, precisely what they mean by realisable capacity and their calc. So that will all come forward. Yeah.
And if I may, I think the point here was that the council's acknowledged they've got plenty of plan-enabled capacity, but there is a revision here to the centres and potentially what goes on around those centres. So hence we're revisiting the data, the technical reporting. Question mark.
All right, was there anything else? Mr. Matheson?
Thank you. Just 3 points. Just on the discussion around feasible, and what I will bring this to the panel's attention if you're not aware of it, but there's a very good decision from the Environment Court, Middle Hill, which is a Warkworth decision from the Environment Court, which is a very useful reminder that actually the best planning outcome for a town in terms of urban form may in fact not be feasible for many years. And that was a debate around whether the zoning should be a mixed use / commercial or a commercial light industrial or a mixed use. And the concern was if you zone it mixed use, it'll just fill up with housing, and actually the urban form requires more commercial zone land. And so the Environment Court said, well, it might not be feasible now, but we're going to zone it so that in the future, when you need commercial land, you're not covered in housing. So it is that longer term view on what's feasible. So that will be a theme of the next set of submissions. And also, obviously, if you build a 3-story house, you're not going to knock it down in 10 years and put a 6-story house on. So it's that opportunity cost of under developing sites as well. So that will be a theme. Just going back to Commissioner Morrison-Shaw's comment on the purpose, I think if I was asked to look at what's the purpose of the enabling legislation, I would say the best place to go in the absence of a purpose statement is probably the 2 objectives in Schedule 3A. I think if you need a purpose, they're very clearly set out what the purpose is. It says objective, synonymous in my view with purpose. And in terms of the homework, 513 houses currently. So, yeah, approximately. So essentially it needs to double, more than double. That's the level of demand. Anything else? Have it? Yep. Thank you.
Doubling might meet current demand, or is that demand projected through for 30 years? No, I wouldn't have thought so.
Yeah, well, that's current. Yeah, that's total. That's now. Yeah, so I'm sure, yeah, it will need to be more, a lot more.
So at the substantive hearing, you'll be bringing us information about what the composition of those houses are. Are they 5 bedrooms, 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms? What is the gap that you've currently got and what you're wanting to basically redevelop on those sites?
Yeah, and that's been my experience in other hearing. Again, remembering, of course, that Kaingora's ambit is broader than just its land, so it doesn't want to get too pigeonholed into just those sites. But yeah, that's helpful context. Thank you. Anything else? Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll see you again, I have no doubt. Barry Pacino, you're on next. Oh, we can take a break if we're waiting. All right. What do you guess? 10, 15 minutes? Okay. Well, let's take a. All right. Well, maybe somebody come and get us downstairs when you're there. Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm not sure we got any additional information from you on that.
No, Sarah.
Right.
My apologies for that. I've been away on leave overseas, and
you get absolutely no credit for being overseas. I'm sorry. Yes.
Yes, I won't mention it again that I was in a summer weather. Anyhow, this is going to be very quick, but I did think it was important, given the number of legal submissions that have touched on Mount Maunganui North, that Mount Business Association puts forward a brief overview And I do so on the basis of being chair, but also from a legal perspective, I will speak to some of the issues that Mount Business Association has around the process to date and the process going forward. My understanding is that yesterday, Waymark Holdings legal counsel may have raised some of the issues that are similar in regards to Mount Business Association, but in particular, theirs is more gravitated towards the issues on residential. Mount Business Association per se is supportive, obviously, of commercial growth, but it's important to point out that it does not consider that the words commensurate in the context of growth have been appropriately considered to date through Plan Change 33. And in terms of the NPSUD policy 3D, the appropriateness for a discretionary nuanced approach for the council in terms of its obligation to look at what is appropriate under the words commensurate, and also in the context of quite a wide range of discretion to be applied to the words adjacent to in terms of walkability, are both elements which in our submission have not been properly considered and are being considered under the Mount Spatial Plan. Now, it's recognised that the council has done a lot to try and speed up that process since Plan Change 33 was notified. And if I can just add to that in terms of my involvement in that, that's been because initially the discussion was very much with council, Mount Spatial Plan's over here, Plan Change 33 is over here, they're quite separate, and we kept saying, well, actually, no, they're not. And the submissions came through very loud and clear that there needed to be engagement of the community in a more appropriate way to look at the very unique characteristics of Mount North when considering the nature of the centre there and the appropriateness of intensification around it. The submission from Mount Business Association has pointed to a number of those elements, as have other submitters. They relate not just as suggested by KO relating to cultural matters and landscape matters, but relating to the coastal environment in a broader sense and the risks that go to that. They're very much associated with infrastructure, in particular stormwater and transport. They're also related to reverse sensitivity issues with the industrial business zone and the importance, national importance of the Mount Industrial Zone and the port of Tauranga being a primary national significant economic element. The other aspect is that the Mount Centre is very different than other centres, and the NPSUD is a blunt tool, quite simply. It was applied as a policy that works very well if you're applying it to a centre such as Auckland, but it doesn't work very well when we're dealing with what is a discrete resort village shopping centre that's catering to, say, 5,000 cruise ship visitors that pop out on any particular day in the middle of summer and then get layered on top of that. We have data and statistics that apply to looking at the economic turnover of our centre and what it does, where we have December and January with huge numbers of turnover, very successful centre in comparison to others around Tauranga on that basis, but then it plunges 50% within a month. And those numbers relate very much to the elements to which the shopping is based on a form of entertainment, strictly and only that. It does not have the level of community services that other centres do have, and that's where the word commensurate is one that we would expect that the Tauranga City Council look at very carefully around understanding that the Mount and the Mount Centre, in the sense of being a shopping entertainment area with a number of intensification of dwellings around it, relates to actually visitor accommodation. Again, KO and Ms. Tate referred to the amount of dwelling enablement that could occur in Mount and that it would be realised. I don't think quite frankly, that relates to the purpose of NPSUD or the Enablement Act in terms of creating residential dwellings. The primary use of Mount North is for visitor accommodation. Most of those apartments, when you do the census, sit empty at that time of the year. It has a really strong fluctuation of visitor accommodation use compared to anywhere else in Tauranga. And given the nature of what goes on there, it has a high entertainment value with very loud noise. It's popular in summer for good reason with young people, but that's not commensurate in terms of reverse sensitivity with the type of residential population. It doesn't have the community services. So that's just a number of the factors that the Mount Business Association isn't saying that there shouldn't be a revisiting of the commercial centre, and I note that Ms Speedy has identified a future plan change, and we totally support that and seek that to happen. But we also seek that it's important through this plan change 33 that there's not a destruction of what's there already, because KO is correct that it probably is somewhere that we jumped upon for enablement, but not for realising any of the goals to which are sought through this reform, but more to sell high-level types of apartments for visitor accommodation to wealthy small cohort of New Zealanders or overseas visitors. That I don't think is the intent of what's being proposed through Plan Change 33. So that's really our submission.
Thank you for that. Any further questions on that? No. All right. Well, we look forward to your own detail in due course. And have you got an update on?
They're not here yet.
Where the golfers
are? I will ask for some leave until they arrive.
That's all right. That's all right. We just take a break. It's fine. Right, Mount Golf Club again. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioners. With leave of the Commissioners, I understand that you've had numerous legal submissions now on the provisions, so I don't think it's going to be important for me to cover the same ground. So in that regard, I'm just going to speak to the specific facts relating to the Mount Golf Club, and with your leave, accept that you're all very familiar now with the provisions and the issues around scope and the case law.
We have certainly had that put before us time and time again, whether we haven't made any determinations on, of course, but
right.
Yeah.
So the Mount Golf course is one of those tricky anomalies as an urban zone where the historic zoning of it has a long history to it. But that doesn't mean in our submission that it shouldn't be considered under Plan Change 33. And the reasons are set out in my legal submissions that this zone, although it's called open space, is one to which it doesn't sit comfortably within that zoning. It is a private commercial piece of land that has as a permitted activity within a scheduled site, spatial plan within the city plan, residential uses in the form of visitor accommodation enabled in high-rise forms of apartments. It is one to which it is completely surrounded by residential uses, and it's on that basis sits very much part of the surrounding residential zone in terms of its look or feel, other than it sits there as an oasis of green to which the residential area around it enjoys that space. But it does so on the basis that it's a commercially viable use within it. And that's where for the Mount Golf Club, they very much need to realise and update what's there to remain commercially viable, which is hence why they have looked to see what land within it is surplus to needs to provide the commercial use to continue of the golf club. And this is an area that is surplus to needs in terms of providing the golf club and does sit logically and comfortably off the end of an existing residential street to be used for residential, and by enabling that use will then enable the golf course to be improved, updated, kept modern for the benefit not just to the members, but obviously to the surrounding residential areas in terms of their enjoyment of that as an open space amenity. It's acknowledged that this doesn't sit comfortably or easily within the form of the definition of residential zone under, I think it's section 77. But in my submission, it also doesn't sit comfortably as either a commercial zone or a centre, but it does provide commercial uses. It also doesn't sit comfortably to treat it as a non-residential urban form of zone either, given that it has residential within it. It's the submission of the golf club that there is the scope to consider this as part of this plan change. And the reason for that is when you look at the cases on scope and the primary reason behind it around natural justice, that the Mount Golf Club has very much been guided by Tauranga City Council as to what to do when it came forward with this idea and applying for it under Plan Change 33. That included consultation with all of the surrounding neighbours, meeting them one-on-one, and they have all, in terms of those that are either supported or opposed, been engaged in the Plan Change 33 process. And my understanding is that there's approximately 20 around 20. I'm not going to give a number beyond that, but I've been given a range between 20 and 30. So perhaps Ms. Speedy can confirm that, but it's somewhere around that number. And my understanding is 75% of those are opposed and 25% are in support. Without wanting to preempt the outcomes through this process, my submission is that in the context of saying that it's legally out of scope is one that we would submit is one that can be considered under Plan Change 33, and that it's very much in line with the intent to provide more housing within a residential zoned area, in the sense that this site sits on all sides as part of a residential area in that sense, and also enables within it residential uses already.
Thank you for that, and we'll obviously get detail later on, but any immediate questions, Vicky?
Just one, in terms of the submission. So obviously you'll be very familiar with the clear water tests.
Yes.
In terms of your view, would the public reasonably have anticipated the MDRS applying to this basically open space zone? And so while it enables some residential use, it's different in nature to other residential zones, isn't it? It's sort of more visitor accommodation, golfing focused, is that correct?
With the context of what's being proposed on the site and the visitor accommodation, my understanding is, in terms of how the council's applying residential uses and visitor accommodation, is that it's treated as residential, whether or not as visitor accommodation or permanent residential, that within Plan Change 33 and I know that it's open to submissions as well, and where we get to on that, but as it stands, that is blurred in terms of what's been notified and what's been sought. So in that regard, what's reasonably anticipated is that visitor accommodation is a form of residential use and therefore had to have been reasonably anticipated. That's already within the city plan as it stands. With respect to what's reasonably anticipated, I would say that on its face, that again may not be clear cut, but the extent to which the Mount Golf Club proactively went out and sought input and consultation and engaged with all of the community that surrounds it or is interested in that. And I note that in terms of membership of the Mount Golf Club, they may or may not be in the immediate neighbourhood. The consultation that the Mount Golf Club undertook was with both. And so it was by no means any type of hidden secret for the Mount Golf Club to put in the submission. In my submission, I would say that there was perhaps more knowledge than would normally be the case with the plan changes notified, because I think everyone would acknowledge that the MDRS and what was notified took a lot of the public by surprise. And I note that this council was not one that took the opportunities that MFE offered around friends of submitters or any of those types of access. They did not do that as other councils did. So the extent to which there was a reaction through further submissions showed the indication that a lot of people were taken by surprise as to what was enabled when it was first notified. But in this case, with the Mount Golf Club, they were proactive and engaging and getting those submissions coming forward.
Just picking up on that, so you've said that they've, taken a proactive and engagement approach. Did they consult with the neighbours and their membership before they put in their submission, or was it after the submission went in and before the further submissions closed, or both?
My understanding is it was before, but I'm just going to confirm that without giving evidence from the bar. It was before. Yes, it was before.
Thank you. And then just looking at the actual submission, what's currently on the site? Is it? I think it said maybe a tennis court, or is that right? Or is there anything on the site?
Mr. Williams, my understanding, and when I looked at it, it was just grass, and it's got some trees there, so it's just open space, but it's not part of the golf course. If you, as in the playing golf course, yes. They have a buffer areas around where the golf, but Mr. Williams can say specifically.
Good morning, I'm Mike Williams, I'm the manager of the golf club. So the site we're looking at is just an open grass field. It backs on to the school that neighbours us. The tennis court you refer to is another parcel of golf club land closer to Ocean Beach Road, which is not part of this submission.
Okay. And then just in terms of, I think, in your submissions at the start, you said it's surrounded by residential land. Are you meaning that the golf course as a whole is surrounded rather than this piece of land? Is that correct?
Yeah, correct. So our land is residential all the way around, except for the school, which would be probably 250 metres of our boundary is the back of the school field, but everywhere else is residential around our course.
And this particular piece is surrounded by mostly the golf course and then backs onto, is it the school?
Correct, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
There's only one neighbour at the end of Fairway Avenue, and then the school, and then the golf course on the other side. Yes, we've something else we've discussed with council is potentially being able to provide the school a walkway to get out the back of their school field onto Fairway Avenue. We'd seriously consider incorporating that into some of the process. We understand the school, and it's been quite public in the news and media, having issues with the closure of Links Ave to traffic, with safety issues with school kids and pedestrians. And I've spoken with my board about this at the golf club, and we would definitely entertain the idea of being able to bring the school students out through our current land and onto Fairway Ave to offer an alternative entry and exit to the school for them.
Yeah, we don't want to get into negotiations at this hearing, so yeah. Now, my understanding from the submission is that you basically then looking for a split zone on the land because it's not comprised of its own parcel, is it?
That's correct. There would be a form of split zone.
Any other question? I mean, I absolutely understand what you're putting before us, and we'll deal with that later on. Now, you're not looking for us to make a determination ahead of the October hearing with respect to scope or non-scope, are you?
So I'd be guided by you on that. My understanding is that this was strategic overview so that you understood the issues and were clear on those before heading into the substantive matters, but whether the commissioners decide to do interim decisions on scope, I'm not specifically clear whether that's been sought as part of the process or not.
No, I was just asking just to clarify whether in actual fact you were seeking that or whether we simply allow this to go through to the second hearing and deal with that at that point.
So in my submission, I think it would be better to allow it to go through to the next stage and then the matter will evolve, particularly with the submitters involved as well. They will be able to attend.
Thank you both, and we'll see you in October. Right. And that is, I think, it for the day. Right. Well, for the weeks, in fact. Right. Nothing else, Council? Nothing? No?
No, if it's acceptable to the panel will provide a written closing statement.
And except that's just going to be an interim statement, basically. So
We're only responding to some particular matters.
Time for that? Sometime before October, hopefully. Yeah.
Is 2 weeks acceptable?
Oh, that's fine. That's the 19th. You want a date on it?
19th is fine.
19th, right. Okay, thank you. All right, well, we're adjourned until you hear from us otherwise in that case. Thank you very much, everybody. Oh,
Closing
yes.
karakia.
Yep, thank you.
Kia ora no tātou katoa, me whakakapi tātou I tā tātou nohoanga I te rānei hei te karakia whakakapi. Kia karakia tātou. Paupaua ki runga, paupaua ki raro, ki taku aroaro e. Kia mau, kia ita, kia mau, kia tū, tau ana,